If your mother kept a tin of bacon drippings beside the stove and called it seasoning, not fat, this list was made for you. I grew up in a kitchen where nothing was bought if it could be made, nothing thrown out if it could become tomorrow's meal. These 25 recipes did not survive because anyone tried to preserve them. They survived because the women who made them never saw a reason to stop. Before this list ends, one dish will remind you of something you ate as a child and have not thought about in years. Let's begin. Number 25. Coffee soup. Before anyone went to school or stepped into the barn, there was coffee. And if yesterday's bread was going stiff, there was coffee soup. You tore the bread into a bowl, poured hot coffee over it, added a pinch of salt, and that was breakfast. People today hear this and think hardship. What it was efficiency. The bread was already there, the coffee was already made. The bread softened into something porridge-like, warm and slightly bitter, filling enough for a child before a cold walk to school. When boxed cereal arrived in farmhouse kitchens, this was the first thing to go, not because it was bad, but because something louder took its place. The next breakfast was also eaten on plain bread, but most people today keep it only for baking. Number 24. Molasses on bread. Most people today have never tasted real molasses, the kind that could keep a child working until noon. Blackstrap molasses on thick homemade bread was the working class spread. Butter was for company, molasses was for us. Dark, slightly bittersweet, sticky on your fingers. Before the supplement industry existed, blackstrap molasses was understood to carry iron. Mothers knew it. They did not call it a supplement, they just put it on the bread. When commercial jam and cheap table sugar arrived in the 1960s, molasses started collecting dust. Bulk buying kept the habit alive longer in Amish kitchens. The next recipe used almost no sugar either, but it was made the night before and fried come morning. Number 23. Fried mush. You made it the night before. That was the whole secret. Cornmeal cooked into thick mush, poured into a pan, pressed flat, left to cool. Come morning, you sliced it and dropped it into a cast iron pan with lard already heating. By the time barn chores were done, it was golden outside, steaming soft inside, slightly salty, dense, filling, served with syrup or with eggs or with nothing. By the mid-1960s, cold cereal boxes had replaced cooked grain breakfasts in most American households. What disappeared was not cornmeal. It was the thinking that went with it. The next dish also started with cornmeal, but it was never breakfast. It was church food. Number 22. Cornmeal pudding. Have you ever cooked something for 40 people using ingredients that cost less than $2 total? Cornmeal pudding was that dish. Sweetened, baked until set, dense, and slightly grainy. One of the oldest recipes in American food history, made on this continent before the country had a name. Almost nobody under 50 has tasted it. Store-bought desserts replaced the home pudding dish at community events through the 1950s and 1960s. The obligation to feed a crowd cheaply and well kept it alive longer in Amish kitchens. The next dish was also community food, but it only appeared at one specific occasion each year. Number 21. Rivel soup. My mother made this when there was nothing else. It tasted like there was plenty. Rivel soup is egg and flour rubbed between the hands into small crumbles, dropped into simmering broth, the name from a German word meaning crumble. They cook up soft and slightly eggy, something between a dumpling and a tender noodle. Nothing was purchased. The broth was already there. The egg and flour were always there. Canned soup made this unnecessary for most households by mid-century. In kitchens with eggs, flour, and a pot of broth, the habit stayed. The next dish also stretched thin broth, but it started with something most people throw away. Number 20. Ham bone soup. The bone was not a leftover, it was the plan. Sunday's ham went to the table, and Monday morning the bone went into the pot with dried beans and cellar vegetables. It simmered most of the day, smoky and rich, the beans gone soft in fat-heavy broth, enough to feed the family twice over. Modern restaurants now sell cups of bone broth for $12 and call it wellness. What they are selling is Monday. Boneless hams and canned soup removed the bone from most kitchens by the 1970s. Whole hog butchering kept it in Amish kitchens. The next recipe also began at butchering day, but it started with what most people never think to keep: These first several dishes might sound plain. They are, but plain is not the same as poor thinking. Everyone represents a complete food philosophy. Use what is there. Let nothing leave the kitchen without becoming something else first. That is not a budget hack. That is a different way of living. Number 19. Scrapple. Scrapple is the only recipe on this list you can still buy in a grocery store, and the commercial version would embarrass the women who invented it. On butchering day, pork scraps that could not be stored as cuts were simmered, pulled, and mixed into cornmeal mush with salt, sage, and pepper, poured into pans to set overnight. The next morning, sliced and fried in cast iron until the outside turned a crackling gold and the inside stayed dense and savory. The commercial version exists across Pennsylvania, but softer and milder than the original. Whole hog butchering required animals, skill, and community, all of which left most mainstream kitchens before 1970. Where butchering still happens on the farm, the original survives. The next recipe also came from butchering day, but it started not with meat, with fat. Number 18. Lard biscuits. Butter-flavored shortening is a compromise. Lard is the original. Biscuits made with properly rendered lard have a crust that shatters and a layered interior. Commercial shortening never quite replicated. The lard came from the hog, rendered during butchering season, stored in crocks, used through the winter. The Crisco campaigns of the 1950s and early 1960s convinced most households that vegetable shortening was modern and healthier. Lard became something to be ashamed of. In Amish kitchens where the hog was still being butchered and the lard still being rendered, that advertising never found purchase. The biscuits stayed. The next recipe also depended on rendered fat, but it was not bread. Number 17. Potato soup. If there was nothing in the cellar but potatoes and an onion, that was enough. Cubed potatoes, onion softened in butter, milk brought just below a boil, salt. Done. Slightly starchy, creamy, the onion sweetening as it cooked. The original was so plain it required real hunger to appreciate. Modern potato soup has been loaded with cheese, bacon, and sour cream until it resembles a different dish. The plain version felt insufficient to a culture that came to measure a meal by how many things went into it. Cellar potatoes kept the original alive longer in homes where supper had to be ready before anyone had time to overthink it. The next recipe also used potatoes, but fried, and always a morning after dish. Number 16. Potato cakes. What did your mother do with the mashed potatoes nobody finished? In our kitchen, they went into the icebox overnight and into the skillet by morning. Cold mashed potato pressed into a flat cake, fried in butter or lard until golden and crisp at the edges, soft and warm inside. Making extra mashed potatoes on purpose so there would be potato cakes for breakfast was the original meal prep, and nobody called it that. It was just cooking forward. When refrigeration allowed leftovers to sit for days without urgency, the next morning's skillet routine faded. Large families cooking for 10 or 12 naturally produced the volume that made this dish work. The next dish also started the night before, but not potatoes. Number 15. Dandelion greens with hot bacon. Dressing. The first greens of spring came free. You just had to know where to look and when to pick. Young dandelion leaves, small, tender, before the plant had flowered, gathered from unsprayed fields, brought inside, dressed with hot bacon fat and vinegar poured directly over, slightly bitter, smoky, sharp, wilted, just barely under the heat. It was the first genuinely fresh food after a long winter of preserved stores. Dandelion greens now sell in specialty grocers for several dollars a bunch. The original source was the lawn, which most American families began spraying with herbicide by the late 1960s. When the dandelions went, the recipe went with them. Unsprayed fields kept the greens available here. The next dish also came from what the land provided, but preserved, not fresh. Number 14. Home-canned tomato soup. We had a jar of tomatoes open before a can opener was ever needed in this house. Every fall, surplus tomatoes went into jars, cooked down, simply seasoned, sealed. One jar opened into a pot with milk or water made a brighter, more acidic soup than anything from a can, tasting like the summer that produced it. Campbell's did not replace home canned tomato soup because it tasted better. It replaced it because it required no planning, no August afternoon at the stove. Convenience won on time, not flavor. The tomatoes and the canning season kept coming in Amish households, regardless of what the grocery store carried. Most of what disappeared from American kitchens did not go in separate directions at separate times. Cold cereal and commercial jam arrived in the same decade. The logic that replaced bone broth also replaced home-canned soup. These were not 25 separate losses. They were one shift. Number 13, chow chow. No 2 jars of chow chow were ever the same. That was the point. Whatever the garden gave more of than could be eaten fresh, green beans, corn, cabbage, peppers, green tomatoes, went into jars pickled in a sweet sour vinegar brine. Sharp and crunchy and bright, it cut through heavier dishes all winter. No family made the same chow chow twice because no garden gave the same harvest twice. Commercial relish replaced it. One flavor, the same jar, every week of the year. The variation was the first thing lost. The next jar on the table was sweet instead of sour. Number 12. Apple butter. Apple butter day was not a recipe. It was a full day of work, and everyone showed up. Bushels of apples cooked down in a large copper kettle over an outdoor fire, stirred for 6 to 8 hours with a long wooden paddle, the whole yard smelling of cinnamon and reduced fruit, the color deepening from gold to dark amber, thick as paste, intensely sweet sharp. Commercial apple butter exists. It is perfectly adequate. It is not the same product. What convenience replaced was not an ingredient. It was the shared labor that made the thing impossible to rush. Where apple orchards and community cooking still hold, the copper kettle still comes out. The next recipe also started with apples, but dried, not cooked down. Number 11. Dried apple snits. A snits pie in January tasted like August if you had dried the apples right. Snits, dried apple rings, the name from the Pennsylvania Dutch word for slice, came from a fall afternoon's work, peeling, slicing, laying out on racks until they shrank to a fraction of their fresh size and turned deeply sweet tart and chewy. They kept all winter without a jar. Reconstituted in liquid, they became snits pie filling, or the base for schnitz and knepp, ham simmered with dried apples and topped with dumplings, a complete pantry meal. Year-round fresh fruit availability ended the necessity of drying. When you can buy an apple in December, the August drying seems like extra effort rather than essential planning. The next dish also required months of advanced preparation, but not fruit. Number 10. Home-fermented sauerkraut. Do you know what sauerkraut is supposed to taste like before it goes into a can? Real sauerkraut, hand-shredded cabbage salted and packed into a crock, left to ferment for weeks in the cellar, has a living tang the pasteurized commercial version cannot reproduce. The live bacteria that made it a genuine probiotic food long before the word existed are cooked out before the product reaches a grocery shelf. One crock fed an entire family through a winter. Canned sauerkraut replaced the crock in most American kitchens by the 1970s, and fermentation knowledge faded within a generation. Large crock fermentation continued in Amish households where fall cabbage harvests still needed preserving. The next dish also used cabbage, but it was the whole main course. Number 9. Stuffed cabbage. We called them something different depending on who you ask. Pigs in a blanket, halupki, a name spelled 6 different ways. Ground pork or beef stretched with rice, rolled in softened cabbage leaves, braised slowly in tomato sauce. Warming, savory, heavy. This was not exclusively Amish food. The logic of it crossed cultural lines because the problem was universal. Small amount of meat, large number of people, cheap vegetables doing the structural work. Labor ended it in mainstream kitchens by the 1980s. The rolling and braising required more time than most families were willing to give a weeknight. Where time and community cooking continued, so did this dish. We are in a different part of this list now. The earlier recipes were about cleverness, pantry logic, seasonal planning, the intelligence of not wasting. What comes next is quieter. These are the foods tied to specific people, the sick child, the grieving neighbor, the woman who started baking before anyone had to ask. The ingredients do not change, the reasons behind them do. Number 8. Milk toast. When someone was sick, you did not call the doctor first. You made milk toast. Bread warmed in a bowl, hot milk poured over, sometimes a pat of butter, sometimes a pinch of sugar. The bread softened into warm white pieces in sweet milk. Extremely plain, asking nothing from a body that could not give much. By mid-century, milk toast was recognizable enough as a cultural symbol that James Thurber wrote about it. Now almost nobody under 60 knows what it is. Crackers, ginger ale, and electrolyte drinks replace the sick-day kitchen logic. Faster, bought, requiring nothing from the caregiver except a trip to the store. The next dish was also an act of care, but not for someone ill. Number 7, funeral pie. Every community has a food it brings to the dead. This was ours. Raisin pie, Rosina pie in some Pennsylvania Dutch households, from the German word for raisin, was the first pie baked when someone died, because raisins did not spoil and everyone had them. The women started baking before anyone had to ask, a filling the color of deep purple-brown, intensely sweet tart, set under a flaky crust. Plain. The point was that a pie arrived at a grieving family's door before the afternoon was over, made by hands that understood what grief required was not creativity but presence. Community grief rituals shifted toward catered meals and restaurant receptions. The act of arriving with something made by hand has no commercial replacement. In Amish households, the funeral meal obligation has not changed. The next recipe was also made for others, but for celebration. Number 6, church peanut butter spread. If you grew up going to an old order Amish Sunday service, you know what I mean before I finish this sentence. Church peanut butter thinned with corn syrup or molasses until it loosened, spread on homemade bread for the meal after service. Smoother than straight peanut butter, sweet enough to spread easily, tasting like something a child would choose every week. Outside old order Amish communities, almost no one knows it by name. It lives where it was always made, at rotating Sunday meals, in kitchens where the community gathers every other week, and someone is always responsible for the spread. This may be the one recipe on this list that has not disappeared. It has simply never left. The next community food was made at a completely different scale. Number 5. Barn-raising beans. You did not make a pot of beans for a barn raising. You made 50 pots, and you started the night before. Navy beans soaked overnight, baked slowly with salt pork and molasses until the sauce thickened dark and the beans went completely soft, dense, smoky sweet, the kind of dish that holds heat for hours on a table in cold morning air. Barn raisings required feeding dozens of men through a full day of hard work, and the women who organized that feeding were doing as much skilled labor as the men raising the frame. The community-scale version disappeared when paid specialized labor replaced communal workdays in most of America. In Amish communities where a barn raising still brings 100 neighbors together, the beans still come. Number 4. Stewed crackers. How hungry would you have to be before crackers and hot milk sounded like supper? Probably not as hungry as you think. Plain crackers simmered in hot milk until soft, sometimes with butter, sometimes salt, the crackers losing their crunch and becoming something mild and warming between a soft dumpling and wet bread. Supper for a sick child, a cold evening dish when the kitchen had already given everything it had. Canned soup replaced it partly because it tasted like more. But stewed crackers also disappeared because the culture stopped recognizing something that simple as sufficient. What you needed from supper grew. What this dish offered stayed the same. The next recipe is one of only 2 on this list, requiring ingredients prepared the previous fall. Number 3. Schnitz und Knepp. This is the meal that used the ham from last butchering season, the apples from last summer, and the flour that never ran out. Dried apples simmered with ham until the broth turned sweet and smoky, then dropped dumplings on top to steam through. Schnitz und Knepp, which means roughly slices and buttons. The broth is the surprising part. Sweetish from the apple, rich from the pork, a combination now appearing on restaurant menus as innovation. It was the cheapest possible winter meal. Without dried apple schnitz in the pantry, there is no dish. Where the apples are still dried in the fall, and the pantry still organized by season, this is still on the winter table. The final recipe on this list is not the most unusual. It is the most ordinary. That is why it matters most. Number 2, brown butter noodles. There was no sauce. The butter was the sauce, and if you browned it right, it was all you needed. Homemade egg noodles, flour, eggs, salt, rolled thin and cut, tossed in butter, kept past melting until it turned golden and smelled nutty and faintly caramelized. Chewy noodles coated in brown butter that adds more depth than most cream sauces manage. Brown butter now appears in fine dining kitchens as though someone discovered it. Packaged pasta and jarred sauce replaced homemade noodles in most kitchens by the 1970s. The tradition held where eggs and flour were on hand, and patience was still considered a normal part of cooking. 24 of these recipes were about making something from something, planning, skill, community, or the willingness to stay at the stove long enough to get it right. What comes next required none of that, and that is what makes it the most honest recipe on this list. Number 1. Bread and milk. I saved the last one for a reason. Torn homemade bread in a bowl of cold milk. That is the whole recipe. No cooking, no seasoning beyond what was already in the bread. You tore it into pieces, poured the milk over, and ate it with a spoon before dark. At the end of a day when the work was done and the kitchen had already given everything it had, the bread softened quickly. The milk absorbed a little of the bread's flavor. It was quiet food, not filling in a dramatic way, but calming. Something about cold bread and cold milk at the end of an evening settled a person in a way a full hot meal sometimes does not. Here is what most people do not know. This was not an emergency. It was not poverty. Farm families ate bread and milk by preference on summer evenings because it was cooling, simple, and fast. Many considered it a genuine pleasure. What it could not survive was the shift in how American culture came to value meals. A supper with no cooking, no complexity felt like giving up. It required a belief that became harder to hold, that simple and sufficient is not the same as less. In kitchens where simplicity was not considered a failure, bread and milk stayed. It has not disappeared. It has only become invisible to a world that would not recognize it as a meal. We did not eat it because we had nothing. We ate it because sometimes bread and milk is everything you need. 25 recipes. Not one required a trip to the store. Everyone began with what was already there, grown, raised, preserved, or left over from something else. That is what they share, not an ingredient, not a cuisine, a way of thinking about food that said, begin with what you have, use all of it, and let nothing leave the kitchen without becoming something. Tell me what you remember. What did your mother or grandmother make that you have never been able to find a recipe for? What did you eat as a child that nobody else seems to know the name of? Leave it in the comments. I want to know what name your family gave it. The table is still there. The bread is still on it. There is a little milk left in the glass.